What if someone told you that to be seen as noble, intelligent, and pure, you had to shave your forehead? In medieval Europe, thousands of women did exactly that. Not out of vanity, but out of devotion. A high, hairless forehead wasn't a style. It was a statement of virtue, of intellect, of belonging. And in that world, beauty wasn't about being admired. It was about being obedient. Double quotes. In the 13th to 15th centuries, across the courts and cathedrals of Europe, beauty wasn't something you chose. It was something that chose you, through birth, through class, and through pain. And one of the strangest, most haunting standards of the time was the shaved forehead. A smooth, empty space from brow to crown was seen as the mark of a truly refined woman. The higher the forehead, the higher the mind. That was the unspoken rule, whispered in court gatherings, painted into religious art, and passed down from mothers to daughters like sacred lore. No one quite knows where it began. Some historians point to Gothic religious paintings, where noble women and saints were depicted with long faces, arched noses, and vast, hairless foreheads that seemed to stretch toward heaven. Others believe it started with the nuns, women who shaved their heads as a sign of surrendering earthly vanity. But what began as religious devotion quickly bled into secular life. The high forehead became a symbol not of God, but of goodness, not of faith, but of favor. In Florence, in London, in Paris, ladies of the court would attend feasts and ceremonies with their foreheads cleanly shaved and polished like marble. They wore long gowns that kissed the floor, gloves of lace, and powdered skin as pale as snow. But the most important part of their appearance, the part that drew the eye always, was that empty space above their eyes. It wasn't just about hair. It was about control. To shave the front of the scalp was to say, I am disciplined. I am worthy. I don't act on impulse. I don't tempt or tease, I submit. There are love letters from the 14th century where young men write to their beloveds with phrases like, your brow is as pure as parchment, your forehead, unmarred by foolish curls, reflects the wisdom I see in your soul. To us today, that might sound strange, but in that time, when everything about a woman's appearance was meant to signal her value as a wife, a mother, or a reflection of family honor, that kind of compliment meant everything. Beauty was not about attraction. It was about approval, and approval was survival. It didn't take long before women of lower classes, peasants, merchants' wives, even servant girls, began copying the trend. They couldn't afford silk or pearls, but a razor blade that they could find, and so a strange kind of equality was born. Even a girl with torn shoes could look like a noble woman, if only she shaved her brow and crown clean. Imagine, for a moment, a cold spring morning in 14th century England. A girl named Eleanor, only 15, sits by the dim light of a fire, holding a small copper mirror. Her mother stands behind her, gently parting her hair. She murmurs prayers under her breath as she presses a warm cloth to Eleanor's forehead. Then comes the blade. The first pass is slow, careful, the second, closer. Finally, with a thread and wax, she removes the fine baby hairs near the temples, the finishing touch. Eleanor's skin stings, but she doesn't flinch. She's been told, it hurts now, so you won't be her later. At that day's market, several men notice her, but they don't comment on her lips or her eyes. They look only at her forehead, and they nod, because to them a bare forehead is not bare. It is full, a promise of obedience, of virtue. In churches across Europe, portraits of the Virgin Mary or Saint Catherine always show the same facial shape, long oval, with soft cheeks and impossibly high foreheads. To the untrained eye, it might seem like bad anatomy, but to the people of the time, it was a guide, a visual map of what holiness looked like. And so young women looked at those walls, those saints, those still, solemn faces, and they copied what they saw. It wasn't just hair they removed. Eyebrows were plucked until the skin was smooth and bare. In some cases, even eyelashes were trimmed or scraped away. Any sign of wildness, of passion, of animal instinct, gone. What remained was a face that said, "I am calm, I am pure, I will not stray." And perhaps most tragically, I know my place. The silence of a medieval chamber was rarely just silence. It was loaded with expectation, with watchfulness, with invisible rules. And for women, one of those rules was this: if you want to be seen as good, you must also be seen as beautiful, but not just any beauty, a specific, narrow, obedient kind, one that never asked for attention, but earned it through quiet suffering. By the 14th century, across Europe, beauty had stopped being just a matter of taste. It had become a matter of morality. Religious leaders, poets, and even physicians began writing about the body not as a natural thing, but as a mirror of the soul. And for women, that mirror had to be spotless, pale skin, still hands, and above all, a high, empty forehead. It was said that a woman with a low hairline was impulsive, wild, even lustful, while one with a high, smooth forehead, she was wise, chaste, holy. One chronicler in 1352 wrote, "The brow is the gateway to the mind, let no hair obscure it, lest it cloud her reason." This belief was not just artistic, it became deeply religious. Church sermons hinted that a woman's outer form reflected her inner virtue. And as those ideas spread, so did the quiet pressure to transform the face, to sculpt it, not for beauty's sake, but for salvation's. It's hard now to picture how deep that pressure went. Imagine a young bride, just 17, entering her new household in Burgundy. She's been trained since childhood to walk with her eyes lowered, to speak only when addressed. On the morning of her wedding, her elder sister helps her prepare. There is no laughter, no perfume, no joy, only the blade and the mirror. She shaves her forehead once more, not just to impress her husband, but to prove she is worthy of being someone's wife. Because in this world, a woman's morality could be seen in her hairline. Art reinforced it. Paintings of saints, noble women, even the Virgin Mary herself, all featured long, narrow faces and impossibly high brows. These weren't just styles. They were visual sermons. Each portrait quietly reminded women, this is who you must become. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a command. Literature joined in. Courtly romances praised heroines with glowing skin like milk, lips like rose petals, and a forehead so broad it held all the secrets of the stars. Young women heard these words whispered in ballads, read them in poems, and absorbed the lesson. To be desired is not enough. I must be good. To be good, I must look like this. Even medicine played its part. Medieval doctors claimed that physical traits reveal moral character. They called it physiognomy. According to this so-called science, wide eyes meant honesty, thin lips showed discipline, and a high forehead, that meant a pure heart. It sounds absurd now, but back then it was taken seriously. Taught in universities, included in noble education, written into marriage guides. To question it was to question truth itself. What's most haunting is that many women believed it, not out of ignorance, but out of survival. They shaved not because they were forced, but because it was expected, because no one wanted to be the girl who didn't look virtuous enough, because in a society where a woman's worth could vanish with a rumor, a misplaced laugh, or a single stray hair, the forehead became a kind of armor. If she couldn't speak freely, she could at least appear pure. And if she couldn't choose her path, she could still choose the blade. But this wasn't just about vanity. It was about trust. Men were told, if her forehead is high, her heart is clean. Priests preached, if her brow is bare, her mind is clear. Families believed, if her face is proper, our honor is safe. In the end, it was never really her choice. Back in the small towns, young girls played pretend, not as queens or fairies, but as saints. They'd pull their hair back tight, tuck it beneath veils, and draw imaginary lines where their hair would be shaved one day. Some cried the first time their foreheads bled from the razor. Others smiled, proud to finally resemble the women in the paintings. Each mark of pain felt like a step closer to acceptance, because in medieval Europe, to be beautiful was not to be praised, it was to be trusted, and to be trusted was to be safe. And so, as the sun set over cobblestone cities and candlelight flickered behind shuttered windows, women continued the ritual, generation after generation, slowly erasing the parts of themselves that didn't fit the frame. What began as devotion became tradition. What began as art became armor. What began as beauty became silence. It was not war that scarred their skin, it was beauty. Not the battlefield, but the boudoir. Not swords or whips, but thread, wax, razors, the quiet, domestic tools of transformation and of control. In medieval Europe, the image of the high, hairless forehead had become a symbol of virtue, but to create that image, to maintain it day after day, required more than faith. It required pain, small, daily, unseen. And behind every noble brow was a private ritual, an act of discipline performed in secret, with tools that would never be painted in the portraits, but were just as important as the gowns and jewels. Let's begin in a noble woman's chamber. The windows are narrow, the fire is low, a copper mirror rests on a carved table. Beside it, a sharpened razor made from hand-forged steel, a spool of linen thread for plucking fine hairs, a small bowl of thickened wax warm by the coals, a cloth soaked in vinegar and herbs. This was the kit of refinement, handed down from mothers to daughters, from maidservants to mistresses, as essential as prayer beads or lace gloves. The process began with softening the skin, a warm towel gently pressed to the forehead, then the scraping. Razor held close, gliding from just above the brows to the edge of the scalp, sometimes in short strokes, sometimes one long, careful pull, and always, always, a tremble of the hand, not from fear, but precision, because too deep a cut would bleed. to shallow, and the hair would return to fast. Next came the threading, 2 ends of linen, twisted tight, pulled taut against the skin. With each flick of the fingers, a dozen hairs snapped free. The sound, almost like the pluck of a harp string, a strange rhythm of pain. Some women did it themselves, others asked their handmaids. Either way, no one flinched. It was routine, expected, normal, just as normal as breathing. And if the razor failed and the thread was too cruel, there was always wax, made from honey and beeswax, mixed with camphor or crushed lavender. The paste was melted slightly and pressed along the hairline, left for a minute, then ripped. No scream, no tears, only a red welt, and the promise of purity. But why go through all this? Because unlike the corsets or jewels or silks that came later in fashion history, this beauty wasn't meant to impress. It was meant to erase temptation, erase rebellion, erase youth. Because a woman with a bare forehead didn't just look older. She looked quieter, still safe. That was the point. Medical books of the time even included recipes for forehead thinning. Mixtures of vinegar, goose fat, dried mouse skin, and powdered lime, rubbed into the scalp to slow hair growth. Absurd, perhaps, but back then it was science. And science, like religion, gave power to those who could define it. Think of Margarethe, a merchant's wife in Cologne. She's not wealthy. She owns no silk. But every Sunday morning, she kneels before her little mirror and pulls the hairs from her temples, one by one. She does this not to mimic the nobility, but to avoid attention. She does it because her husband's mother told her is what good wives do. She does it because when her forehead is bare, she is left alone because, strange as it seems, sometimes conforming is safer than resisting. And then there's the irony. Many women did feel a kind of pride in the pain. There are letters and journals where noble women write about the elegance of the ritual. They describe the tools, the calm, the precision, the satisfaction of perfecting themselves. Asterisk, I bled today, one wrote in 1421. But my reflection was worth it. The church, of course, had opinions. Some clergy condemned the practice as vanity. Others encouraged it, saying it subdued feminine urges. But in the end, the church didn't need to forbid or permit it. Society enforced it better than any sermon could. Women did it to themselves and to each other. Mothers shaved their daughters' foreheads by age 12. Sisters helped each other pluck and clean, and maids were trained to perform the task without question, like trimming candles or washing linens. It became invisible, just another part of life. And yet it's important to say, not all women accepted it. There are a few paintings, a few poems, rare and brave, that show faces with full brows. A quiet resistance, a forgotten rebellion, but those women were often left out of stories. Because to write history, one must be seen. And those who defied the standard were simply ignored, so the razors kept scraping, the wax kept burning, the thread kept snapping, and each little pain, each plucked hair, became a stitch in a larger pattern, a world where beauty was not an art, but a warning, a way to say, I understand the rules. I will not step outside them. I am safe. They told her to be beautiful, and she became quiet. They told her to be still, and she disappeared. By the late Middle Ages, in castles and manors across Europe. The smooth, high forehead was no longer just a look. It had become a language. It whispered things a woman could not say aloud. It hinted at obedience, virtue, silence, and for those living within that system, something even more chilling began to settle in. Duty no longer belonged to the self. It belonged to society. Imagine waking each day not to express yourself, but to erase yourself, to trim away the very features that made you you. A few hairs at a time, a little discomfort at a time, a lifetime of surrender in small, quiet gestures. That was the reality for countless women in the 14th and 15th centuries. And it wasn't just nobles, merchant wives, farm girls, and even nuns all lived under the same unspoken rule. You must appear holy or risk being seen as wicked. The forehead, once simply part of the body, had become a battleground of identity, and as the razor scraped higher and higher, so did the expectations. It wasn't enough to be good. You had to look good, in the very specific, carefully curated sense that the church, the poets, and the painters decided. Consider a girl named Isabel, raised in a French manor. Her tutors teach her to read psalms and keep her voice soft. Her mother teaches her to bow low and hold still when her hair is scraped back. At 13, she cries the first time the wax burns. At 14, she smiles as the mirror shows her brow, bare and proud. At 15, she's told she's ready for marriage. She's done everything right, but deep inside, she wonders, what else must I remove to be accepted? This wasn't simply cosmetic, it was psychological. Because when you repeat the same gesture, day after day, removing, reducing, hiding, it changes how you think about yourself, and after a while, the face in the mirror isn't really you anymore. It's the version of you that the world rewards. The danger of the high forehead wasn't just the pain, it was the message behind it. If I look like the saints, perhaps I'll be forgiven for my thoughts. If I seem silent, perhaps no one will ask what I believe. And so, over time, a generation of women became masters of self-erasure, not because they were weak, but because they were taught, again and again, that their survival depended on it. They became fluent in the art of disappearing beautifully. Meanwhile, men rarely faced such expectations. A nobleman could be wrinkled, scarred, even ugly, and still be praised for his mind or his courage. But women, their entire worth could hinge on the shape of their brow, the softness of their cheek, the stillness of their expression. If she frowned too much, she was bitter. If she laughed too loudly, she was vulgar. If she refused to shave her forehead, she was dangerous. The saddest part, many women passed these rules on themselves, not out of cruelty, but out of habit, out of fear. Because when your own safety is tied to how you look, you begin to believe that teaching your daughter to conform is an act of love. Better she learns the rules now, they would whisper, than suffer later. The cost was high, not in gold or silver, but in the quiet loss of self, the stolen confidence, the silenced minds. And yet there were cracks in the armor. Some women began to question, in letters, in journals, even in quiet rebellion, refusing the razor for a week, letting a few strands grow wild, risking gossip for a moment of honesty. A few dared to write about beauty as a trap, not a triumph, a mirror that demanded only one kind of face, one kind of life. And behind the scenes, change began to stir. The Renaissance was approaching, ideas of selfhood, art, and individuality would soon rise, and with them, the question, what if beauty didn't mean obedience? What if a woman could be praised not for how she looked, but for who she was? But for now, in the soft candlelight of medieval chambers, the rituals continued. The razors scraped, the wax cooled, the mirrors reflected not identity, but expectation, and the price of obedience was simply everything else. In a world where silence was called virtue, a whisper could sound like thunder. They were few, scattered, and largely forgotten by the scrolls of official history, but they existed. Women who refused the razor, refused the thread, refused to bow their identity to the fashion of the high, bare brow. And though they left no monuments, no parades, no canonized beauty, their rebellion lived on in portraits with unplucked brows, in poems that questioned, in mirrors that didn't lie. Let us begin in Florence, 1473, a city humming with trade and splendor, but also awakening slowly to the light of the Renaissance. In the home of a well-to-do goldsmith lived a young woman named Giovanna. Her sisters followed the custom. Each morning, their maid heated the wax, and by candlelight their foreheads were stripped bare. But Giovanna, bold, quiet, and bookish, resisted. She had read of it in secret. She had heard stories of women in ancient Rome wore their hair like crowns, not burdens. She had seen the frescoes, faded and cracked, of saints with full, natural faces, and one morning, when her mother handed her the thread, she simply said, "No." The room fell silent. Her mother stared, the maid froze. But Giovanna did not repeat herself. She kept her brows, her widow's peak, the dark hair at her temples. And when her uncle, a visiting bishop, saw her, he remarked with unease, "She looks like she questions things." Indeed, she did. Giovanna was not alone. Across Europe, a quiet shift had begun, not in the courts or the councils, but in the corners of bedrooms and ateliers. Some women, emboldened by new ideas of the Renaissance, began to see beauty not as sacrifice, but as expression. Take Marjorie Kemp, an English mystic who lived a generation earlier. She wore white, preached in public, refused her husband's bed. Though she wasn't protesting beauty standards directly, her life shouted one clear message. A woman could define herself, and that alone, in the 15th century, was a kind of revolution. Some resistance took quieter forms. In a monastery near Lyon, young Sister Agnes wrote in her devotional journal, "Today I ask why our reflection must look like still water." The abbess said, "Because waves disturb the peace I do not wish to disturb, but I do wish to be." She never shaved again. Others used art. In Bruges, a painter known only as the widow's apprentice left behind 3 surviving portraits of women with full, wild hairlines. Even as the court preferred neatness, her signature, a single vine, curling along the subject's temple, nature intruding on conformity. Historians later dismissed her as eccentric, but today her portraits whisper something louder than elegance. They whisper refusal. To rebel in that era wasn't simply about grooming. It was about what your face said to the world. A high, bare forehead said, "I follow, I yield. I do not question." but a natural face that was trickier. It suggested complexity, resistance, uncontainable thought, and for a society built on hierarchy, that was dangerous. It's important to remember this rebellion came with consequences. Giovanna was forbidden from attending her cousin's betrothal feast. Marjorie Kemp was in prison for her outspokenness. Sister Agnes was quietly reassigned to kitchen duty, a polite punishment for her disobedient scalp. Even the painter from Bruges was never commissioned again after her third unorthodox portrait. These weren't vile attacks, but they were erasures, and in a world where to be unseen was to be nothing, erasure was a kind of death. But the flame didn't die. Each small defiance added oxygen to a slow-burning change, not a fire, perhaps, but an ember, one that would survive through centuries. Because rebellion doesn't always roar, sometimes it hums. And even as these women faded from records, their decisions lingered in whispers and memories. A granddaughter who found her grandmother's sketchbook filled with self-portraits, untouched by wax, a novice nun who read Agnes's journals and chose to leave the convent, a painter's apprentice who inherited the brush and the courage. What these rebels shared wasn't rage. It wasn't even protest in the way we know it today. It was something quieter, something more intimate. It was the decision to face the world with their true faces, to let their hairline speak for them, to let their reflection carry their voice, even when they said nothing. And as the 16th century dawned, the world began to shift. Ideas of individuality grew stronger. The printing press spread images, not just of saints and queens, but of ordinary people in all their varied beauty. And though the high forehead trend would echo into future styles, it began to lose its power. Because when women started to see themselves, not just in mirrors, but in stories, books, paintings, the hold of conformity loosened. In time, Giovanna's daughters did not shave. The widow's apprentice had students who painted women as they were, and in the quiet, faded pages of forgotten books, the names of women who questioned still remain, maybe not famous, but free. So if you ever wonder how beauty changed, not just in style, but in meaning, remember, it wasn't just queens and artists who led the way. It was girls in candlelit rooms, saying no to a thread. Trends fade, paint peels, but the quiet things last. Centuries have passed since razors scraped against pale foreheads by candlelight, since wax dripped across brows in shadowed halls, since women learned to disappear beautifully. But the strange truth is this: the high forehead never truly vanished. It only changed shape. Today, you won't find noble women sharpening razors to chase a saint-like brow, but scroll through a modern magazine, a filtered selfie, a runway show, and something may feel eerily familiar. The language is softer now. We speak of clean lines, youthful symmetry, refined hairlines. We sell it in products, not prayers, in procedures, not punishments. But beneath it all lies the same old whisper: shrink yourself, soften, smooth, obey. It's easy to laugh at the past, to scoff at women plucking their brows to the bone, to pity the nobles who feared being seen as wild for having a fringe. But every age has its rules, its sacred beauty, its silent sacrifices. And though today we don't call it virtue, we still call it worth. Ask yourself, why is the ideal still so narrow? Why do we reward sameness over soul? Why does boldness still scare us, especially on a woman's face? The high forehead may be gone, but the spirit of it lingers. In the medieval world, women shaved to signal purity, control, piety. Today they contour, straighten, tone, lighten, to signal success, health, modernity. The tools are different, the message is not. Be polished, not powerful. Be pleasing, not present. And even in sleep, many women carry this script, tucked deep into their muscles, their memories, their mirrors. But there is a shift, the same quiet rebellion that stirred in Giovanna's Florence, in Agnes's monastery, and Marjorie's hymns. It stirs again. You can hear it in the voices of artists who paint real, unedited skin. You can see it in social movements reclaiming textured hair, scars, age lines. You can feel it in people who say, "This is my face, this is my story. I choose what beauty means." Because here's the truth. History doesn't just live in textbooks. It lives in us, in what we inherit, what we repeat, and what we resist. And the story of the high forehead isn't just about hair. It's about control and the courage to reclaim it. So if you ever feel unsure, ever feel that tug, that quiet ache that says you are not enough unless you change, remember, this isn't new. It is centuries old. It once lived in candle-lit chambers and stone chapels. It once whispered to queens and kitchen girls alike. And it still whispers, but now you can answer. Answer like Giovanna, who chose her brows and her books. Answer like the widow's apprentice, who painted women as wild and worthy. Answer like every unnamed girl who chose to let her reflection tell the truth. Not because it was easy, but because it was hers. There's something powerful, even radical, about keeping what others tell you to hide. About choosing your face, your voice, your image. And in that choice, the medieval story ends, but your story begins now as the night deepens and the candles of memory flicker low. Let us rest in this quiet truth. You are not strange for wanting to be seen. You are not wrong for wanting to be whole. You are not alone. Not now, and not in history. Beauty has always been a battlefield. But tonight you are safe, you are enough, and you are exactly where you should be. Close your eyes, let the echoes fade, let the voices rest, and dream. Not of silence, but of sovereignty, the high forehead, duty and pain in medieval Europe. Thank you for listening. If this story stirred your thoughts or lulled you gently to sleep, consider subscribing for more tales from the shadows of history. What beauty standard from the past fascinates or frightens you the most? Leave a comment below. And don't forget to like and share if this brought peace or curiosity to your night.